Welcome to Travel Around the Block. Join Joel, Mike, and their guests as they explore how Web3 and AI are reshaping the way we journey, invest, and connect across the globe.
All right, welcome back to Travel Around the Block, where we dive deep with trailblazers shaping the future of travel and technology. Today, we're at host Mike and Joel, and we got Jeff Berk with us. He's the founder and CEO of Tripkicks. Jeff's startup does something pretty clever. They're putting intelligence right into the moment where employees are actually booking their flights and hotels. Tripkicks guide people to the right choice in real time, better budgets, prefer suppliers, sustainability, all that stuff we'll cover as well. So that's all happening with Jeff. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, great to be here, Mike and Joel.
Thanks for joining, Jeff. Good to see you.
We always love to just jump into it, Jeff, and get to know you a little bit better as well, besides Tripkicks. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey and background?
Sure. New Yorker, after school, went to work for IBM. Knew I wanted to get into business, but didn't quite know exactly what. So management consulting was a perfect fit where I got to do a lot of different things. I've always been the type of person, a lot of people don't like change and they run away from it and are scared of it. I've kind of been the opposite, where I like change, which is weird. So management consulting was a good fit. I spent some time at IBM, did the whole road warrior thing. And then I moved to Aquis Consulting Group. And that's really where I got I like to think like I grew up at Aquis, right? Like I got my lay of the land in the industry. I got to do a lot of cool work. I stayed as a road warrior despite working for a New York-based company. But yeah, that's where I got to learn a lot of the travel expense and procurement industry. I rose the ranks there and got to do a lot of sales work, delivery oversight. So I really had an opportunity to work with a lot of different Fortune 500 companies and help them on their journey to optimize travel expense and procurement, which at that point in time was a lot about technology, right? It was taking like manual processes and things that were not necessarily like web-based and putting them online and optimizing them. It was a really cool experience. And I just got to learn the industry really well. I got to learn what companies' needs were that were not necessarily being met by the major players out there. And ultimately that kind of led us down the road to Tripkicks.
Very cool. And Mike, if you don't mind, I can't resist just a quick question and based on what Jeff just said. So sorry, Mike. Jeff, when you were traveling, but you weren't yet maybe super duper consultative about travel, I'm just curious, did anything jump out at you from the user's point of view where you were the user? Was there anything that was particularly frustrating or inane about the travel industry and how it works when you were purely on the user side of the fence? And I'm just curious if you remember any of those perspectives or insights that you had from that chair.
For sure. Yeah. There are two things that jump out. One is I was at a client trade show the other day and I was talking to somebody about this. We were just an EA who does a lot of booking and we were like, hey, remember when things were different when it came to like travel and expense reporting? And I was like, I used to carry around a roll of Scotch tape and blank paper. And I did that because when I was taking off and landing, that's when I would do my expense reports and I would tape my receipts on the piece of paper. And I was always very like productive because when you're on the road, you don't want to lose that time. So you want to be efficient. So that's what I did during takeoff and landing. I have my headphones on and I would be doing my expense reports. So that definitely stood out. One of the cool things actually, like a precursor to getting into the industry, one of my roles at IBM, we were actually spinning up the largest services project that IBM had ever done in the history of the company. So we were like onboarding 150 people. So it was like spinning up a little mini travel program from scratch, right? Because we have these 150 people that we need to locate. Where are they going to live, right? They're coming from all over the world. And what's the policy going to be as it relates to that? And so it was a little mini travel program that we got to build from scratch. And it would be years later until I got more insight into that at big companies, but it was cool to be able to draw from that experience.
Very cool.
Fantastic. I can relate to that, Jeff, because I've been a rower in my past life as well for quite a few years. And you triggered me a little bit when you said Scotch tape and receipts on paper. I had a little bit of a PTSD. Because
I think I saw Mike twitch for a second there, just for a moment. I was just like, oh, that paper cut.
When was the last time people thought about that, right? Well, we all did it.
Yeah, and it was a nightmare just having to shift through all of those. But I think that's a good segue, Jeff, to get into a little bit about Tripkicks. For those who don't know, can you tell us maybe my elevator pitch on Tripkicks was terrible, and you can correct anything that was missed. But yeah, I'd love for you to give us an idea what exactly Tripkicks do, and how did you decide? You talked a little bit about that, but how did you really dive into focusing on what is this problem that you're trying to solve with Tripkicks?
Yep. So yeah, so high level, there are really two things that we focus on, right? We focus on optimizing traveler behavior, and we focus on better connecting travelers with the information that they need to be successful in their
Okay,
trip.
I
So that's
I get
like
the second
the
part
world.
very clearly, but I think for the audience, when you say optimize travel behavior, what does that exactly mean?
So what we do, and a little bit of but we look at the travel manager and the travel program, right? And we are like obsessed with their
Mm,
goals. What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve in building out a great managed travel program? So a lot of it relates to traveler behavior, right? They have a program, they have a policy, they want to make sure that travelers are aware of it, are following it. They need to drive compliance, they need to drive cost savings, they need to drive any other goals that they have. And what we've seen is a lot of that relates to traveler behavior, making sure that travelers are not only aware of these things, but that they're actually abiding by them and following them. So when we talk about optimizing traveler behavior, it's really from the perspective of the enterprise, and more specifically the corporate travel program and or travel management team that we are talking about. And then one of their goals, obviously, and not maybe not one, maybe a lot of their goals relates to traveler experience, right? They're making sure that travelers have a good experience. A lot of companies, that's a competitive advantage of theirs. So that's where kind of the second focus of, hey, we want to make sure that travelers have what they need to be successful, right? It's not just about being the policy complete police. It's about building a great program that works for everybody. So that's what Tripkicks does. That's our world. That's our focus area. I'm happy to get into the origin story. We didn't quite start there, I'll say.
No, like I think that's great. Let's get into it. What is the origin story of Tripkicks?
So when we started up, which was actually right before the pandemic, so it was an interesting time to be starting a company in the business travel space.
No doubt.
Interesting moment. I could talk about that more if we want to, but
That's a whole other
um,
podcast, right?
all the founders living through the pandemic and the roller coaster
Right.
that
I
was.
will say though,
Um,
for a early stage startup that started almost during or pre-pandemic in terms of timeline, and then being able to still survive post-pandemic and potentially thrive as well, I think that there's something to be said. So maybe we can get into that a little bit on the trial and tribulation of the pandemic and how you guys survived it, but still want to focus on the origin story and then progress
Sure.
from there a little bit.
Yeah. As I kind of mentioned, a lot of the work that I was doing at Aquis kind of gave us a front row seat to what some of the challenges were at big companies, and just got to know the ins and outs of the industry a bit. And we saw an opportunity to better help travel managers achieve one of their goals, right? And we know that travel generally reports to procurement. Cost savings is really a universal concept that's always going to be important to them. It was around the same time that actually Rocket Trip had started up, and they famously commercialized the concept of, hey, if we could reward travelers for going above and beyond, that could be a win-win. So we looked at that and we were like, hey, that's super interesting. We think we could do that and maybe not need, I think they raised $35 million or something like that. So we're like, we think we could do that without raising $35 million. And we were partially right. So we started up and raised a little bit of capital, built a product. We're competing. And we saw it was one of those things where the concept itself was really strong, but in practice and in theory and in taking this to companies, there were definitely some operational challenges with it. We were competing, we were getting RFPs, we won a bunch of RFPs, which was really cool. We were off and running, but in the back of our minds, we were like, I don't know if this is quite going to take off the way that we were hoping it would. So we were looking at other things in terms of how do we use some of the technology that we had built, and also the things that we were learning from our clients. Now that we had clients and we were talking to travel managers all the time, we were just wanted to know what other things were they struggling with? What did their world look like? Where was there more opportunity where we might be able to help them with other things? So that kind of got us down the road of maybe there are other ways. Cost savings is important, but maybe there are other ways to help drive cost savings, right? And by the way, what else is important to you? And let's see if we can help with those things too. And it was around that time, that's when the pandemic set in. So it was just a little bit more of a clean slate in terms of, hey, do we still proceed in that direction, or do we look at some of these other opportunities that we had been exploring even before the world came to a stop?
Jeff, I'd be really curious to Mike's point a moment ago. How did the pandemic as a context influence your thought process, your process of sorting strategic direction? Because there's almost an analogy to be made that the pandemic was a very unique time of almost unprecedented reshuffling of the deck, but in a certain way with technologies that are emerging, um, we're almost at that kind of moment again, in a sense. And I'm wondering, how did the pandemic affect how you sorted through issues? And is there anything at all generalizable that an audience member might be able to glean for how to navigate either the current moment that might feel turbulent to them or a future, I hate to say it, but a future storm that might arise, whether of any kind at all, just even if
We
it's
do have
industry
a
disruption?
travel. I was going to say, Joe, we do have a travel storm happening right now, right? With how much everything is costing more due to the Iran war. That, like, I was looking at the chart earlier about like airline costs, and we already know how much they're compressed. But so I think we're in that moment. So this is actually a really good and the point in question, Joe.
I think it was interesting because whenever anybody asked me about that time, the first thing that comes to mind was just like, it was a very emotional time, right? For everyone in the world, right? But for travel founders, you guys know it's a small industry, everyone friends, everyone knows each other, everyone wants to help each other out. So I remember talking to everybody at that time and there was no wrong answer, right? It was like, it was a clean slate. Everything was on the table. Whether you were going to say, you know what, I'm just going to try to sell right now, or I'm just going to fold, right? Everything was okay. We're like, we're still trying to figure this out. We're looking at a couple of different things, right? And thinking that for us, it was about thinking about what travel was going to be like when it did come back. What were the differences going to be? What was going to be the same? And where we could potentially fit in. And that's where we settled, right? It was the type of thing where we had some ideas and made some predictions, some of which we ended up being right about and some of which we ended up being wrong about, mostly the time frame of everything. But it was just a question of, okay, if we can keep going and start to move in this direction, we think we have something that's going to be really relevant when travel does come back. And then it was a question of when will that be? So for us, that was our path during the pandemic and what put us on the map. We won BTN Innovate during that time, which was entirely remote. Back then, there was still no traveling. And we had a really interesting offering to serve a very specific use case, honestly. It was, hey, what's for companies to restart their travel programs? They're going to need information, like more so than they've ever needed before. And companies aren't going to feel comfortable unless they had a real way to deliver very accurate and specific information. So that was our use case that we focused on during the pandemic and what got us going coming out of that and working with travel programs to help them restart.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question, Jeff. I'm wondering, when you think back to that time, was there anything at all liberating about it? You mentioned a sense of anything is possible, any answer is okay. And I just wonder if there was any liberation in that kind of environment.
I'm a very candid person. Joel, you know me pretty well. But the honest answer was it was such a difficult period just because you had resources. I mean, there were a handful of companies that had raised prior to going into the pandemic. And for them, it might have been a little bit of a blank slate, but we didn't have that. We didn't have that luxury. We were kind of getting things going then. So for us, it was just like, hey, how do we just keep moving forward? Right? It was like, if we can build this concept, then we can generate some momentum. If we can show that people are interested in buying this, then we can further the momentum. So while I want to say, yeah, it was liberating, there was so much pressure. And to be able to do that with virtually no resources was just, it's a time that I hope I never have to do that again, honestly.
Certainly. And appreciate the candor. Thank you.
Yeah. So going back to Tripkicks, Jeff. So earlier you mentioned nudging travel behaviors. You mentioned how you guys are incentivizing them with kind of this share saving rewards model. And obviously since then, the whole platform, it's evolved into something broader around travel guidance and program optimization, it seems. So that's a pretty significant pivot. So I was wondering, was there anything specific that you learned from the first kind of share saving rewards approach that shape or influence where the platform, the product is today?
in having that initial product, getting clients, going out and trying to, with all these sales meetings we were having, it gave us the opportunity to really learn our stakeholder, right? It taught us, okay, our stakeholder is the travel manager. We got to know lots of travel managers. We got to know that persona in general, right? We know that, okay, in order to get in with an enterprise travel product, that's our stakeholder, right? We're not going to the CFO. We're not going to other people. That is our constituent. So it definitely taught us that. And we got to see others in the industry not doing that and honestly probably regretting it and facing the consequences of it. But it gave us an ability to really talk to people and hear their challenges, right? And that's what led to the creation of the broader platform that we have now, is it wasn't, hey, there's just one challenge and one way to solve it, which is kind of what we started with, right? It's let's look at all the challenges and the common themes that they have and develop ways that we can actually help them in a more holistic manner, right? Yes, cost savings, yes, policy compliance, yes, traveler experience, right? And what we've been doing more recently is having worked with a lot of companies now in getting a deeper understanding of those areas. We've been able to build okay, everyone knows that corporate travel programs are concerned with those areas, but what's the next level down in terms of how do they actually impact them? And that's what we've been building out over the past couple months. And it's been just a really exciting opportunity to take everything that we've been learning over the past couple years and put that into a product in a way that we haven't necessarily had it before. So I think that learning started way back when, right? When we got to learn, just see the perspective of all the things that they were concerned with in their world. And I think as a founder, one of the traits that I have probably to a little bit of a fault, and it probably goes back to my consulting roots, is I want to solve problems. And if you hear about these problems and you're like, how do we help? My natural instinct is, how do we help solve them? And my team's probably, Jeff, stay out of our problems. We solve our problems. But that's how I've always looked at things. So it's been this curiosity and saying, all right, I see that exists now. Like, how do we help make it better? And with Tripkicks specifically, the realization was that a lot of challenges, a lot of the problems related to either traveler behavior, just visibility and access to information. And if we could help with those two things, then we can help solve a lot of problems.
Jeff, I'm curious, as you talk about that instinct to be curious and to broaden, how do you reconcile that with startup realities where sometimes resources aren't, let's say, unlimited? And so how do you circle the square on ambition and budget realities from a founder's perspective?
Let me know if you have any good tips for it. There's a natural tendency, I think, for a lot of people to be like, hey, I can go fix and make that better. But yeah, you're right. You also have to stay laser focused on what really matters. So for me, it's been a little bit of a balance. There's just a natural curiosity if I'm going to want to explore certain things and just get a little smarter about it, see if it's worth exploring more. And then at that point in time, I can determine where do I think we want to go deeper and invest. But it's not easy, especially when you want to explore a lot of different areas and see if there's merit in further exploring them, which is a big part of, you asked before about a liberating part of a startup. To me, that's it, right? Startups, they're known for moving faster because you have to, right? And you have the ability to explore a lot of things, and people expect that to some extent. And that, I think, is one of the liberating things about a startup, is that you're not necessarily fixed to a super regimented roadmap the same way that like a Fortune 500 company is.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like that advantage of being able to adapt and change and evolve with changing times is probably, it's always been true of startups, but the times I think are making that an even bigger advantage. It's like during times of accelerated change, it seems like that nimbleness becomes even more crucial. And I wonder if I could get you to weigh in on a sort of issue that leaders of any size organization, from startup to really any organization, might wrestle with, which is, should we, these, just pick your own words, but one way to phrase it would be, should we stay the course or should we adapt and reinvent? Maybe it's a false dichotomy, I don't know, but I'm just curious how, from a founder's chair, how do you think about when to continue forward as is and when to almost reimagine and reinvent? And how do you know when is time for which?
I've got some pretty strong thoughts on that. One of my mentors told me a couple years ago when we were working on a roadmap or whatever, and if you're Pfizer, you have a 3-year roadmap or whatever, a 5-year roadmap, right? And you execute to it. And that's what you do. And you rally the whole company around that, and everyone knows their piece and what needs to be done. If you're a startup and you do that, you're just crazy. You're wrong. That's not what you do, right? And it's not to say that you don't have a plan and you don't know the big things that you want to do, but it's more about who will adapt and change over time. And that is, like I was saying before, that's expected and embraced just in the DNA of being a startup. But it's also that's how you grow. That's healthy. If you're not doing that, I think that's a problem. And so I'm definitely a fan of, yes, you need your job as a founder, as a leader, you need to be learning all the time, watching what's going on around you and seeing what you need to change, whether it's big or small. That is a constant thing. And this idea of having a locked roadmap that you're super positive is going to work exactly the way that you thought it would is just not true. Because you haven't done this before. You're doing something new. That's the nature of your company. You're learning as you go. And I think to the second part of your question, what the really challenging piece is how do we know when to change or how big of a change? And I read this a couple months ago. I saw this concept that as a startup, you're constantly making like little small refinements and testing things that you can kind of go back on if you need, right? You're not necessarily changing the total direction of something just because you're like, yeah, we should just change the total direction. No, you're testing things, right? You're testing little things, and that's informing your perspective on whether a broader change is needed. And it's this very delicate balance of like, how do you do that in a safe way that doesn't result in something catastrophic? Because the reality is you're going to be wrong a lot, right? And you need to create a situation where that's actually okay when you're wrong because it's small, right? It's small and you're able to learn and adjust from that really quickly. So I'm a huge believer in your role is to look at what's going on around you and think, what can you take away from that? How do you change things to make it better? And if you're not doing that, I think that is a challenge.
Is there a key in your experience, Jeff, to making those risks, if you will, those micro changes reversible easily? How do you run experiments kind of at scale in a way that's always readily reversible if you do discover you're wrong?
I think being out there, talking to people, testing ideas, is really important, whether that's internally with your team, right? Hey, what if we did this? Oh, they didn't react well. They didn't react well to that, right? Or the same thing with the client, right? Creating like a little bit of a safe space, and you're not necessarily definitively saying something. You're just kind of putting it out there to get some feedback. But I think it's definitely one of those things that's more art than science. It's definitely something that's always on my mind. Again, if there's something that an idea that I think might have merit, I want to test it, right? And talk to some people who are further than I am about it and get some informed perspectives. And that's always the approach that I've taken.
Cool. And I have to say, I think it is probably an art, and maybe an underestimated aspect of that art is conversation itself. I think sometimes tech founders, their first instinct is to touch code, and occasionally the chat is the place to learn before you've bothered to expend the time. But bringing it back to your recent offering that you mentioned, Jeff, you've introduced an offering that my understanding you're calling Catalyst. We've heard you mention that Catalyst is both behavioral and situational. And I wondered, if you don't mind, could you elaborate on what you mean by that? I hear the words, I know the words, but yet I don't quite get the theory of the case. So just maybe share a little bit more about that.
It kind of goes back to the two components that I painted earlier, right? One is talking about how do we guide traveler behavior and really make sure that we're helping travel managers meet their goals as it relates to optimizing traveler behavior. And then the other is connecting travelers with the information they need to be successful. So those two words are derivatives of those. And so behavioral, what we think about is the traveler, what are they doing? What should they be doing? How does it relate to policy compliance? Where is the friction? What does the company want them to do? So that's what we mean by behavioral. It's really the behavioral aspect as it relates to the program and policy. And situational refers to, if you think about the traveler, like even us as business travelers, right? We're always in situations where, like in the trip, we're like, you need something. There's something you need to know, and you need to go and get that information, right? So that's really what we mean by situational, right? You booked an international trip. Do you need a visa, right? Or is there some documentation that you need, right? You're going to visit your company office in X location that you've never been to before. Where is it? How do you get there? What do you do when you get from the airport? Do you take the train? Do they arrange pickup? Like any of that, right? Those are just some really common examples, obviously. But as a traveler, what information could you possibly need at every point in time in the trip, and it's going to vary based on where you're going to. So that's what we mean by situational, the situation that the traveler is in.
It's interesting, Jeff, thinking about those two concepts. It almost reminds me of the concept of degrees of freedom, where if you have enough situation, enough context, then the action eventually is almost constrained. Given all things, this is what would make sense to do. I'm curious, as you look at our industry, has the industry historically been better at the behavior or better at the situation, or are they falling down on both? What would be your diagnosis of the industry in terms of knowing the behavioral aspect or the situational context?
But I think they're both done today. Like as a if you have a corporate travel program, like you can't have that and not have some degree of guidance and some degree of like reference information that the traveler can access. So like the concepts of those are not new. I think what we've seen is that there's so much improvement that can be done. And like every travel manager will admit that. They'll be like, yeah, if I had more time and more resources, I would do this and that, and I would do this and that. And they just can't. So I think there's just a lot of improvement in both of those. But as an industry, like these aren't new concepts, right? The industry is not a stranger to these concepts.
Yeah, for some reason, it's been a challenge to bring into practice. Just as a low-hanging fruit example, I would go to Silicon Valley, get a cup of coffee. I'd go back and fill out an expense report, and it's like that coffee is in violation of policy, and it's clearly you've never been in Silicon Valley and know the price of a cup of coffee. There's a
I do
lot
have
of
a
room
question
for
for
us
Jeff
to
though,
get.
on
Go
on
for it. Go
Catalyst.
for it.
I'm just you're building Catalyst through that process. If we talk about behavioral and situational, could you tell us if there is one or two major behavioral or major situational in those two buckets? What are those top things, let's say behavioral, that travel managers trying to nudge towards, or business travelers are actually looking for?
Sure. Yeah, on the like one of the like learnings that we've had, as I talked about earlier, is like that next level down of, okay, the industry talks about driving compliance all the time. What does that mean? Compliance to what, right? What are the specifics here? So that's been a big part of what we've been building out at Catalyst. So could be things like advanced booking, right? The further in advance you book, generally the cheaper it is, right? Some exceptions, but generally that's a universal policy element. Certainly preferred suppliers, certainly on the hotel side, a little bit on the air side. Buyers from a travel program perspective, they're on a constant goal to get that number up, right? Classic things. A lot of our clients, either they have city caps or we offer dynamic rate targets. So generally they have one of those two things, and it's looking at, they're both aimed at giving spend guidance in particular. Nobody wants to restrict choices. That was kind of decided a decade ago. No, we don't restrict choices. You can see everything, so that when you go out to consumer tool, you see the same thing. So we want to more guide choices, right? You can see everything, but we want to show you what the right decision should be. So certainly from a spend, those things are important. A lot of our clients recently have been focused on minimizing either like same day trips or single night trips from a sustainability perspective, but also from, are you going for a meeting? Do you really need to go for that 1 hour meeting? Can it be a Zoom? Can you combine it with another trip if you're going back and forth there frequently? So about like
There's
15 or
quite-
so
yeah.
that we've seen.
You'd be happy to admit one of my biggest, probably behavioral changes that I'm like always bouncing against the program is obviously you have certain hotel and airline loyalty. You're trying to stack these miles and points. So sometimes I kind of go out of policy a little bit just to be able to stay at a preferred hotel brand or preferred airline.
Especially because of all the consolidation that's been happening in the industry over the past couple of years. A lot of times there's not as much friction there, especially if you're a big company. Chances are, if it's a major city for you, or even like a somewhat major city, you probably have more than one preferred, right? That's a natural friction point that I think a lot of programs have done a good job addressing, and has gotten easier because of the consolidation of the major brands. It's always going to be there, but you know, even the communication of it, I would say, goes a long way for a lot of companies. Just letting the travelers know that, hey, this is what's in our program, and this is why too. The why is often left out.
That's a great point, Jeff. I think the why is often the key. But when you have the world's toughest case, by which I mean Mike Sung, when you have an absolutely tough nut to crack, how do you go about changing traveler behavior? And are there any nuggets from behavioral science that come to play?
We've been able to roll up our sleeves on that recently. And I think I am not a behavioral scientist. We do not have
Let
behavioral
the record
scientists.
show. We
Yeah.
admit into evidence that you are not speaking as a PhD in behavioral
Right.
science, but you almost have a real world
Yeah.
PhD because you actually see the effects of your product.
What-
So I'm really curious to
well-
hear what you say about this.
I think what's really interesting is that, and again, my colleagues are not behavioral scientists, but that's okay because behavioral scientists exist and they've done tons of experiments and they've proven tons of conclusions, right?
Yeah.
And applying it to something we know really well, which is corporate travel. So it's like, that's where we've focused, not on, oh, why does this happen? But it happens. Here are the experiments. You can read them and you can read the science behind it. And now let's take those learnings and see where they fit in a corporate travel program. And one thing that we didn't really talk about from an origin perspective is when Tripkicks started, everything was about point of sale, right? And that was the opportunity. It's, hey, if we could be there at the point of sale, then there's a lot we can do, right? There's a lot that can be done there that couldn't have been done previously. But one of the things we've learned is that, yeah, that's a super important touch point, but it's not the only touch point for a traveler, right? Like in the case of, let's say, Mike Sung is our user and just ignoring everything we're saying to him, right? That might land totally differently for a person and it's that recognition of people think differently at different touch points and react to information differently at those touch points. So as we really leaned into guiding behavior and access to information, one thing that became very clear is not just about the point of sale anymore, right? Once you book something, there's other information you need. And the ability to say, hey, Mike, you just booked that. You really shouldn't. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in our space is that little improvements to numbers go a long way. And what I mean by that is like corporate travel programs, especially at big companies, they're really big. We're talking about companies that are spending, $10 million to $150+ million. So if you talk about just being able to influence and change and guide behavior and change behavior for a small fraction of that spend, like that's still very material. So I think that's something where do we expect everyone to, do we expect everything to get to 100%? Like, absolutely not. But if you could move the needle 5%, like that's huge for a lot of these companies. Yeah. So you don't need to be able to impact everyone. You just need to be able to maximize your opportunity that you're going to have an impact on as many people as you possibly can. And I think going back to behavior science, that's where it comes into play. There's nothing unique to corporate travel. We're talking about communication, and we're talking behavioral science. To me, is not more applicable to corporate travel. It's applicable to any time you want to maximize what you're trying to communicate and the reaction that you're trying to have. And in a perfect world, everything we do related to communication, we're taking these behavioral science experiments and applying them and learning. But like the reality is no one's doing that. It's not practical. But if you're a system, if you're a technology system, you could build that in, right? So you have the ability to say, hey, we're going to take all these learnings and we're going to build it into a system so that Joel, when he's designing his corporate travel program, he doesn't need to do that. It's already been done, right? And by having that in there, it's going to maximize the opportunity that all the Mike Sungs in there, we're going to get to some of them. We might not get to all of them, but we're going to get to some of them. That's really the idea.
Huge apologies to Mike, who's a wonderful traveler and highly compliant. So Mike, I apologize. You're
I
not
actually
quite
really
that rogue.
enjoyed that part that Jeff was talking about because it brought back memory of a book I read about, 10, 15 years ago. There's a professor, his name is Dan O'Reilly. I'm not sure if you've come across him before, Jeff, but he wrote a book called Irrational Behaviors, and it talks towards and irrational behavior really is about behavioral science in the marketing space, if you will, right? How are you selling and the behavior of individuals, things like their mental wallet shares or product placements in the supermarkets and to nudge you to buy one thing versus the other, etc. So I think that really makes sense because if you can apply that successfully backed by science through all these experiments that they've done in the marketing space, there's definitely some of those that can be translated into behavior changes for business travel.
I think one of the interesting things for us too, as we explored that, is everybody, whenever anyone hears behavioral science, there's probably one thing they think about, right? It's the wording, it's the play, like the colors. But the reality is there's a bunch of things behind that. And I think that's what makes it really interesting and creates an opportunity that we've really tried to capitalize on, is it's the way something is worded. It's where it appears, it's how it appears, it's how the other things around it also potentially impact that. And it's taking all of those things and again, applying them to corporate travel. So it's like, one of the ahas was like, it's broader than what most people think. And if you're able to make those things work together, you're putting yourselves in the best position to actually elicit change.
We think we know how we're making decisions, but there's a lot happening. And I think even for somebody who spent a lifetime, some hypothetical person who spent a lifetime studying behavioral science or psychology, the depths of all that are probably beyond what anyone could fully comprehend. So I do think it's a rich field. And I wonder, Jeff, I'm curious in your exploration of that field and stuff you've embedded into the product, is there any finding about behavioral science that most surprised you or seemed, wow, I wouldn't have thought people think like that or decide like that, or that these are their decision drivers? Anything that jumped out at you that was particularly interesting or surprising?
I don't know that anything was particularly surprising. I think what some of the challenge was sifting through things that might not be applicable for what we're doing, right? And it's like certain things come to mind, right? Like when you're, one of the big ones is like spending your own money versus company money. Like it's a different lens and you have to think through, what is that? How does that translate? Does it translate? What does it mean? Is that what we lean into for that type of message or not? Like, nothing was surprising per se, but I think there was a lot of that. Okay, that's proven, but how does it apply? And that was what made that was where I think we spent most of the time thinking through how does that apply to our product.
Yeah. Were there any approaches you've tried that just absolutely didn't work? Any almost anti-examples of, wow, it turns out this does not drive the desired effect? Anything that's an anti-example?
Certain things, and these are probably more obvious in retrospect, but there's a lot of things that travelers, that if you're a corporate traveler, there are a lot of things you want to tell the traveler. You can't tell them a lot of things. And so this idea of, okay, you really have to prioritize, and depending on where they are and what mindset they're in at that point in time, like you have to figure out what the most important things are. And we definitely had a couple of examples where we're like, it's just too much, right? It's not reasonable for somebody to be able to sift through all of that. So I think that's probably been the biggest like anti-example, especially as we were focused on one touch point primarily. We were like cramming a lot into there, and we're just like, you can't cram everything into point of sale. It's just not, you need to diversify from there.
I think that's a great anti-example. I like that a lot. And I think it points to almost a subtopic or something underneath that, which is empathy as the key that unlocks the door, because information overload, too much copy, too much information is just one manifestation of not being kind to the user and not understanding what I jokingly refer to as our cognitor. That cognitor, we are wise and deep and profound, but that cognitor for all human beings, even if you're Einstein, is relatively stupid. And I think we underestimate the fragility of the cognitor and overtax it sometimes. Anyway, I love the example. Over to you, Mike.
And again, this idea that if you can move the needle even a little bit, like for companies like this, it has a material impact. The other day, I was talking to a car rental provider who was a new vendor that came in with one of our clients about 6 months ago. And they were saying, they're like, yeah, the implementation was like really smooth. And we're like, yeah, we made it known that you were the new car rental provider. We made it really easy for everyone to see and the benefits. And it's just, they're like, yeah, that was great. And it's like certain things that sound very obvious, but they're not always done because there are so many of these things that like, if somebody had the time, they would do all of them, but they just don't have the time. So I think that's been one of our observations too, is like, sometimes it's just the act of doing it, right? And making it visible. And again, this idea of prioritizing time, letting everyone know that there was a new provider was probably one of the most important things that the travel program needed to communicate at that point in time. So we treated it as such. And as a result, we saw the results that everyone was hoping to see.
So with the amount of questions that we have, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to everything, but I definitely want to touch on the agentic AI question. And I also want to just touch with you, Jeff, real quick to see, is there any, like question 9 and 10, Were there any of those two, one of those that you say you really would like to have a conversation around? Same for you, Joel, if there's a particular question that you feel like we should really dig into, because I think we only have time for, at least for me, like maybe two more questions before we have to wrap.
Say 9 for me versus 10.
Okay, cool.
Good.
All right, Jeff, so your position as a add-on layer that sits on top of an existing booking tool and TMC infrastructure. So you're not trying to replace them. In a world where many OBTs or online booking tools and TMCs are adding their own guidance feature, how do you make sure Tripkicks doesn't get absorbed or commoditized by the platform that you're sitting on top of?
After we made the Catalyst announcement, I was talking to Jay Campbell from the company Dime, and he asked me a similar question. He said, "A lot of TMCs might say they do some of this today. What's your response to that?" And I was like, "Look, we're not the first people to say, let's message a traveler. Let's give them information. It's not unique. It's done today. It's done in a million different ways, right?" What we thought was missing is this idea of a holistic platform that's built around like the full universe of what travel managers are trying to achieve, right? So this like idea that there's one platform that all things travel managers want to communicate, enforce, make available to travelers exist across every touch point, every channel, and is personalized to the travelers, like their specific trip, their specific behavior. And not just that, but it's actually automated, so that it's not work for the program to have to set this up. Because if you think about a message, like, okay, what do we want to message? It needs to be written, it needs to be designed, what channels are we putting it through? Let's work with these other stakeholders. There's a lot that goes into that. Where like the reality is it just doesn't happen, right? We hear that from vendors where they're like, yeah, we have this new promotion. We sent it over. We don't know. We sent it over to the program, and if they have time, they'll do something with it. So we just constantly saw that. We don't think this idea of messaging travelers is, oh my God, like we're the first people to think about that. But we definitely saw there's a huge opportunity if we're able to build this in a systematic, intelligent approach that actually checks the box for all the things that a company wants to essentially like message and communicate and drive behavior around in a way that's super easy for a corporate travel program to just turn on, and they don't have to do like the work around all the behavioral science stuff that we thought about. That's where we see like us continuing to carve out a niche for us that honestly the others in the space, but like this is not their primary focus, and nor will it be for the foreseeable future.
So Jeff, I'm hearing something in my mind, the right message to the right traveler at the right time for the right channel, right platform, have the intelligence behind it, have the automation behind it, give you the analytics so that you can do a lot of the performance behind that as well. So with that said, with AI agents taking off the way that they're taking off, and AI that atomic that can potentially, I think it's going to happen. We can all see that very easily, that agents is going to book travel for us, leisure travel, corporate business travel. They're going to understand our preferences pretty in depth, more than I think an individual travel program manager might be. I wonder, how does that make Tripkicks more powerful or less? Play both sides, if you will, like a devil's advocate approach maybe. But because the entire premise of Tripkicks platform is influencing, let's talk about travel behavior, right? The human decision making at the point of booking. Will AI agents also need to be influenced? How does that impact Tripkicks? Do they need to skip that entirely?
Yeah, so I guess just before that, I'm a huge advocate of AI. I personally use it for everything, and I think this has informed a little bit of my decision on my response to the question. I think there's a ton of value AI adds in terms of getting you to a decision. I think we're still far away when we talk about a lot of decisions that are made by us humans in terms of AI making decisions for you. I think there's, in terms of even building a lot with AI, a lot of the work goes into making it more efficient for you to get to a decision. But at the end of the day, I want to make that decision, right? I'm not a believer that like in a couple of months from now, AI is going to just be automatically booking things without the traveler saying yes. I think it's going to be used to say, hey, we've done the legwork. We know you. Here are the options. But I don't think it's going to act. It's the same with, I think about myself, like I'm in New York. Is it ever going to know what airport and airline I want to fly? I don't even know, right? Like it depends on so many things. Does my calendar know that I have to take the kids to Taekwondo? It might not, right? So there are all these things where like it just might not know all these things. And I don't think we're making the decision. I think it's gathering the information to help you make a decision. People talk all the time about like restaurants. Oh, I used AI and the restaurant didn't exist. And it's like, all right, there are ways to fix that. But do I want it choosing my restaurant? No, I want it to give me some options based on me, and I want to choose. And I think for Tripkicks, I think it's a huge opportunity because it's like we're taking all this information about the traveler, about the behavior, about the policy. Like someone needs to pull all of that together. And are we going to be using LLMs and new technology to do that? Absolutely. But there's still a role for somebody to do that. And every company out there does not want to build that. Corporate travel programs are not in the business of building corporate travel technology. They want to be recipients of it. So I think as AI is going to unlock more opportunities to better enable the synthesis of this information and distilling things for it to be easier for the traveler to make a decision. But I don't think it's making the decision for them.
Very cool, Jeff. If I could, I wonder if our audience wants to learn more about Tripkicks, what channels can they follow you on?
They can follow us on LinkedIn. It's probably our most active B2B channel. Visit our website, tripkicks.com. So you can definitely follow me as well for hopefully some interesting content.
Cool. Jeff, congratulations on the launch of Catalyst. It sounds very well timed for where the market is, and really appreciate you making some time to be in our little coffee shop. It's been a fantastic conversation. So thanks again, and appreciate you being here. Have a great rest of your day. Truly appreciate it. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks,
Fantastic.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I will stop the record.
Thanks for joining Joel and Mike for another episode of Travel Around the Block. If you have any questions or topics you would like to see discussed on the show, or if you'd like to be considered as a potential guest or sponsor, please reach out to us at hello@travelaroundtheblock.com. And of course, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Wishing you a wonderful day wherever you are around the block. Hello.